My fellow Americans, thank you for allowing me into your homes and your lives, no matter where you may be watching us. This evening, Tuesday, March 1st, President Joe Biden will appear before a joint session of Congress to provide his version of the State of the Union in the People's House, which has once again been fenced from the people and barricaded by armed military. There are various opinions about the state of the nation at this time, and President Biden is sure to put him and his administration in the best light possible. He is sure to discuss how he and his administration have looked out for the health of the nation as a whole and of you personally. He will talk about how the high price of gasoline provides an opportunity for us to find alternative energy sources and work toward cleaning up the environment. President Biden will even try to convince you that he has stood up to President Putin over Ukraine, but that his hands were tied. Because of the continued divide in the country, President Biden is not likely to mention his call for and commitment to unity that was his mantra throughout the inaugural address. If he does, he will state that he is working hard to unify the country and that his opponents are the ones furthering the divide. President Biden will continue to tout the dangers of the coronavirus, COVID-19, as though it is the biggest threat to humankind in history. He will call for continued obedience to governmental mandates and recommendations and remind you several times that you need to get vaccinated. He will assure you that the Fed has the reported inflation under control. This is a temporary situation, he will say, from which America will come back stronger. He will use his infrastructure policies and bills as evidence that the country is building back better. The United States is a humanitarian country, he will remind you. Because of that, we cannot turn a blind eye to those experiencing hardship, racism, and political or other persecution. Instead, we should welcome these people with open arms. He will avoid any discussion about COVID or other diseases and viruses that can be brought into the country. Similarly, he will sidestep any discussion about opioids that come across the border. If he does mention the opioid overdose epidemic, he will tout recent settlements and judgments that have brought billions of dollars to the states to fight this. President Biden will portray that the country is in dire straits due to his predecessor. He will remind the country that this is exactly why he was elected president and that he is working hard to build the country back better. So where does the country truly stand? Despite his calls for unity in his inaugural address, President Biden began on day one and has continued for the past 13 months to further divide the nation. Even as many sources reminded him of his statements from a town hall in October 2020, President Biden began issuing what became a record number of executive actions to enforce partisan policies and ideals. This, in contrast to his having been portrayed to have stated that governing through executive order was tantamount to acting as a dictator. Since then, he has encouraged his party to do anything but gain a consensus among Congress in passing bills meant to further the president's agenda. When members of the Democrat Party have voiced opposition to the bills being considered, the president and party leaders have, either directly or through surrogates, subtly and outright threatened the political lives of those in opposition. For bills presented to the House of Representatives, the president has worked with House leadership to invoke the reconciliation process to make the bill easier to pass. Similarly, the president has attempted to work with Senate leadership to quote-unquote blow up the rules of the Senate to avoid the possibility of a filibuster. These measures are taken to pass partisan legislation without having to go through the rigors of gaining a consensus of the members, something that the president himself said was necessary to avoid a dictatorship. In the midst of this, President Biden has, through the time-honored and honorary title as leader of his party, overseen efforts intended solely to discredit and demean the president's predecessor. Despite being a legislative and not enforcement body, the House of Representatives, through its Democrat leadership, has been conducting an investigation into the incident of January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol. Instead of acting on evidence obtained by law enforcement agencies, House officials have taken it upon themselves to perform the investigation themselves so that they can use any evidence they obtain against former President Donald Trump in impeachment proceedings. As former President Trump garnered only 3.5 million votes shy of half of the total votes cast for president in the election that saw President Biden take the office, to publicly go after someone many in the country consider a champion for causes in which they believe is to target them and their ideals as well. This action does not bode well for an intent to unify the country. Along with these actions, pressing and even forcing mandates on the people that are based on what many call questionable science is also divisive. The question about the science comes from the flip-flopping of the agencies and organizations developing the guidelines that are being used to generate the mandates. Even the president and vice president themselves expressed concerns with the vaccines being developed under the governance of President Trump. Even though they themselves took the vaccines, they continued to express concerns publicly right up to the time that they took office. Once in office, and despite a mission by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that the vaccines were not true vaccines and did not prevent the spread of the virus, the president and his administration continued to push for people to take the vaccines in order to prevent the spread. Under their watch, and despite the vaccine mandates, the virus has continued to spread, and even those vaccinated have perished. It seems that the more that vaccinated persons continue to contract and succumb to the virus, the more insistent that President Biden became about the need to be vaccinated. Through the various mandates and strong suggestions, as they would likely be described, President Biden has presided over one of the largest thefts of constitutional rights in U.S. history. While they may have lasted only a relatively short period of time, these restrictions and removals of the rights were nonetheless evident and setting a precedent that may only be expanded in the future. With approximately 98% of the vehicles driven in the U.S. requiring gasoline or diesel fuel, one of President Biden's landmark achievements on day one was to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, a method to bring crude oil to the U.S. in a more efficient and environmentally friendly manner. He then conducted a hasty withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, furthering the instability in the Middle East. He has furthered this instability by working to resume the agreement that the U.S. entered into with Iran during the presidency of Barack Obama. By negotiating a new agreement that will prove at least as favorable to Iran as President Obama's was, President Biden has effectively disenchanted and possibly disenfranchised such oil producers as Saudi Arabia, as well as other U.S. allies in the region like Israel. Further, by allowing Iran free rein while the agreement is negotiated, President Biden is allowing Iran to threaten 20% of the world's oil as that much passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is completely under Iranian control. With about 12% of crude oil processed in the U.S. coming from the Middle East, any instability in this region causes what Americans have already seen: an increase in gas and diesel prices, which then leads to an increase in the cost of everything that Americans consume. More recently, President Biden and his administration have further hampered domestic oil and gas recovery as the courts declared that the Department of Interior could not weigh the cost of climate damage in determining whether or not to allow or renew new leases. Since they were prohibited from using their own subjective formula to determine whether or not leases would be allowed, the administration decided that all should suffer as a result. To add fuel to the fire, President Biden all but encouraged Russian President Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. President Biden even went so far as to threaten the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with a shutdown as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When Russia initially entered what it calls independent regions of Ukraine, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halted certification of the pipeline that would bring oil and gas from Russia to Western Europe through Germany. As Russia supplies Germany with upwards of 1/3 of its oil and gas, this only further restricts supplies available to Americans. To compensate, Germany will have to seek out other sources for their oil and gas supplies, many of which also source the U.S. So as inflation is rising daily, as store shelves are barren due to various supply chain issues, and with fuel prices increasing at what has become the coldest time of the year, President Biden has chosen to egg on these price increases even further. In regard to Ukraine, President Biden has only threatened financial sanctions against Russian individuals to whom the sanctions would mean very little. While the U.S. and other NATO allies have sent equipment and weapons to Ukraine and have threatened air coverage for Ukraine, none have sent troops in to help in Ukraine's defense against Russia's military forces. Although still listed as the most powerful military in the world, the U.S. still has almost 750 bases in 80 countries worldwide. Looking beyond this, the U.S. has an estimated 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. Ranked third in the world in the number of personnel, these international deployments account for almost 13% of the U.S. Armed Forces. Due to commitments to various countries and organizations such as NATO, South Korea, and others, this leaves the U.S. military extremely thin to act or react to any specific situation, particularly one that does not directly threaten the United States. Even so, President Putin has now threatened the use of nuclear weapons. Despite the claim by White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, this is a threat unprecedented in history. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, there was no actually stated threat of nuclear weapon use. Instead, there were generic threats of a military response by then President John F. Kennedy if the Soviet Union were to continue its plans to install nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. Despite the historic threat by President Putin, combined with mounting reports questioning his mental stability and restraint in using nuclear weapons, the White House seems to downplay this threat even while the Federal Emergency Management Agency is posting on its website something not seen from the U.S. government since the 1980s, instructions on what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. Oh, whatever you do and wherever you take shelter, Don't forget your mask and to maintain social distancing, as the FEMA instructions warn. Because of this, President Biden's words have fallen flat and exhibited the weakness that the U.S. military currently holds. While President Obama was criticized for his apology tour around the world, President Biden has shown the same weakness from the White House by admitting through omission that his military forces could not stop President Putin from taking action in Ukraine. This comes only months after President Biden chose to hastily leave Afghanistan and provide the Taliban, the group that warranted continued U.S. involvement in that country, with billions of dollars worth of military equipment and weapons. Back to the domestic front, though. The official unemployment rate in the country stands at around 4%. That rate is outstanding, and President Biden should be commended for that, except when you look into what that number truly means. The official unemployment tally is based on those actually applying for and receiving unemployment benefits, which are typically paid in situations of involuntary termination of employment for reasons not justified under legal means. Those seeking and receiving unemployment benefits have generally been released from their position as opposed to resigning or leaving their position voluntarily, and have been released without them creating justification for the termination of their employment. This does not necessarily indicate the number of people truly out of work. This also does not include those who may have been unjustly released from their position, but for which the former employer has been able to create a legal justification to release the employee from his or her job. It also does not include those who have been denied continued benefits due to having lost eligibility or having extended beyond the term of their benefit period. Even with such a low unemployment tally, the rate of inflation is almost double the rate of pay increases, almost making it cost prohibitive for some to work rather than receive government benefits. With the U.S. inflation rate exceeding 7% and gasoline almost double what it was at the beginning of the Biden presidency, it makes sense for many to remain at home than to seek outside employment. This has left the American consumer and business owner in a bit of an irony. While the unemployment rate is low, there are fewer workers participating in the workplace. This has left industries such as retail, including restaurants and grocery stores, scrambling to get workers to stock the shelves and take care of customers. It is also creating situations where, despite President Biden's protest, shelves are bare and menus are incomplete, rivaling scenes from Soviet-era grocery stores and bread lines. Even with all of this, people continue to flock to the U.S. from other countries. Particularly coming to the U.S. through Central and South America, thousands of would-be immigrants reach the border each and every day. Many choose to try to enter the U.S. through other than legally defined means, and President Biden, through his administration, has decided to allow them entry. Without stating explicitly that the border is open, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which governs border security, has essentially invited these people to come into the country regardless of their method or intentions. This is suspected to have continued the pandemic situation in the United States due to the lack of care taken to ensure that migrants and immigrants are not bringing communicable diseases and viruses with them into the country. Lax enforcement of Title 42 of the United States Code, the Public Health Service, has led to upwards of 25% of those crossing the borders into the U.S. illegally testing positive for COVID-19, and then being allowed, even if only temporarily, into the country. While purporting to take measures to protect the citizenry against the spread through lockdowns, required isolation, mask mandates, and vaccine mandates, this administration has all but left the door open to those who have the virus to freely enter and roam about the country. This lax enforcement has also led to a resurgence of diseases all but once eradicated from this country. Diseases such as measles, mumps, tuberculosis. Other diseases that are making comebacks throughout the world also include scarlet fever, whooping cough, leprosy, polio, gout, rickets, and even scurvy. Even more than COVID-19, these diseases are placing our nation's children's lives at risk, as there are a limited number of pharmaceutical manufacturers authorized to provide treatments and preventions, including vaccines, for these various diseases and viruses. One can only speculate as to why a government would allow the frivolous entry by those possibly or even positively carrying these life-threatening hazards into the citizenry. Since major corporations, including pharmaceutical companies, live and die by their stock prices, and since many government employees, including members of Congress and leading health officials, have pharmaceutical company stock as part of their portfolios, one has to wonder if there is a connection. With no official connection to any corporation, most of the government employees are exempt from insider trading rules developed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which oversees stock trades and transactions. This has led to calls for legislation that would prohibit Congress and others from using their knowledge of situations to which the public is not generally privy to trade and purchase stocks before the information does become public. In the true spirit of a lack of transparency almost constantly on display by the administration and Democrat leadership, they have fought this, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi even saying that she would not have such a bill brought up for consideration on the House floor. This harkens back to Speaker Pelosi's remarks as she prepared the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, for passage in the House. We have to pass the bill so you can find out what is in it. In this case, that can be translated to, we eventually have to make this information public so that others can take advantage of the same trading knowledge we have. This attitude has gone farther than Obamacare, though. It has allowed legislation to be passed that has put this country in debt by over $30 trillion. Despite occasionally posting record tax revenues, our deficit continues to increase minute by minute to the point that it has almost reached $3 trillion. To bring that down to an elementary level, we're spending about $1.75 for every dollar that we bring home. With the U.S. median household income of $67,521 in 2020, we'll round that to $68,000. Imagine that household already with credit card and other debt of $680,000. Instead of using the income to pay off the debt, the household continues to pile on spending about $119,000 in that same year without paying off any of the bills already accumulated. Without paying any of the debt, how long can this household go without having to file for bankruptcy? This lack of transparency, combined with the enabling of the continued pandemic by top government officials and the continued infringements on the rights of the citizenry, also have led to the threat of a trucker protest surrounding President Biden's State of the Union event at the Capitol this evening. To double down on the reasons behind such a protest, the Capitol has once again been fenced off from the people, and military troops in the form of the National Guard have been activated to act as law enforcement. These actions further prove that leadership of the House and in the administration is more interested in developing evidence of crimes by a person with whom they have an unsatiable animus than in truly representing the people. If this were reversed, and if they were truly interested in representing the people, they would seek the reason behind the events of January 6, 2020, and of the upcoming expected trucker protest. They would be seeking an understanding of the events and a way to represent their constituents effectively, bringing forth the unity for which President Biden called during his inaugural address, instead of seeking to criminalize a redress of grievances to government officials. Actions like these have taken what was once considered the freest country in the world to 17th in that category. The United States has fallen behind the likes of Germany, a socialist country, and Estonia, a former Soviet republic. Inflation, with a target rate of 2%, has reached over 7% and is continuing to increase. This has affected households across America, with gas prices almost or over twice what they were on November 3rd, 2020. Meat prices have skyrocketed such that a common go-to for a family midweek meal, Chili Mac, is now considered a luxury. Families are no longer able to save for the future as they have to spend to survive now. Even with an admirable official unemployment rate, workforce participation combined with supply chain shortages make it difficult for factories to manufacture goods and for stores to keep shelves stocked. So, even when a family can afford a nice meal or some sort of extravagance, it may not be available for them, reminiscent of those countries that were under Soviet rule. The truth of the matter is, my fellow Americans, that our great country, once considered the leader of the free world, is headed quickly to second world country status. While the great majority of us have pride in our stars and stripes, the divisive rhetoric and policies coming from Washington, D.C. have worked to have us focus on our differences rather than our similarities. By focusing on each other in this manner, we have taken our focus off of keeping our government officials accountable to us, the people. Instead, we have allowed them to drive our actions and activities instead of the other way around. We have instead become accountable to the government for our actions, and in many cases, seek government approval and have to be more accountable to them. The State of the Union, my friends, is not good. It's not so bad, though, that it cannot recover. By pulling together, holding our government at all levels accountable to the people, by focusing on our similarities as Americans rather than our differences, and by rejecting restrictions on our rights through lawful and constitutional means, we can turn this around. Our future is bright if we act accordingly. So I ask each and every one of you to each and every day take a step to exercise your rights as an American. I personally monitor various news outlets and government websites to keep track of what our government is doing. I then use my First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press to share that information with the public and with you. Some exercise their First Amendment rights by videoing government buildings and employees in the course of their duties. Others exercise their Second Amendment rights by carrying a handgun on their hip as they walk around public, or by carrying a long gun over their shoulder in public. The list of these examples could go on and on. The point is, those who do this are exercising their rights as Americans and are working to make sure that these rights are not lost. By subordinating ourselves to government whims, we are disrespecting those who have fought for this country and those who continue to do so. Each one of them, and many civilians, have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. By not exercising the rights they have given an oath to uphold, we are disallowing them from being able to support that Constitution. While the President generally provides an update on the State of the Union annually, the State of the Union is not necessarily up to the President or to Congress. Instead, it is up to us, the people. So long as we continue to allow things to continue along their current path, the State of the Union is not well. Take this message and go forth to, as was once the mantra of a racial group, be the change. Once we collectively do that, then the State of the Union will change and improve. My fellow Americans, I thank you for taking the time to listen and hope that you take my points to heart. May God bless you, and may God bless these United States of America.